This is the end of the series. Thanks for being here. This is where Cliff and I tie it all in, where we have the emotionally catastrophic events, the taxation, and we have a little bit of fun with it. Cliff and I will be speaking in the future more about taxation. This is one of Cliff's main passions. He believes it's one of the most important things for the American people to know about. Knowing your rights, knowing what is right, what is lawful, what is legal. That's the point. One point to make here too, there's a difference between being a tax protester and being someone who is tax exempt and someone who is tax excluded. These are different terms that we will explore in future podcasts. The thing is, you can't protest a tax to which you're not subject. You can't protest a tax from which you are excluded. It doesn't apply to you. And there are a lot of things that just don't apply to you. We hope you get value from this conversation.
A whole lot of life, from my impression now, is in the attitudes that we develop within ourselves. And I think the best thing we can do is keep in mind the idea of triangulation. If you only have 2 points, you can't get a real accurate description of where you are in place and time. You have to have 3 points in order to be able to have a third point to judge where this other stuff is coming from or going to. And if you only have 2 points, it's right or wrong. If you have that third point, it's okay. Why would the opponent, or the other person's argument, in what conditions would they be right? And also to ask yourself, under what conditions would I be wrong? And
Right.
what you're going to find out is there's a commonality there.
That's a good point. Yeah, that would make sense because if
And that's where all communication has to start from, is an agreement frame. You have to find some place that you can start where both of you agree on the concept.
there's a cartoon meme that I've seen a few times of where a person on the left and right, and between them is a number, and the person on the right says 6, and the person on the left says 9. Well, who's right or who's wrong? And a lot of situations are like that. The thing is, it actually has nothing to do with the subject. It has to do with the fact that they don't have a reference point that's common.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I found that's useful with institutions such as Toastmasters is there's a reference point from which we're all operating.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the reasons we can all get along, even with our entirely different backgrounds in Toastmasters, is because we have a shared objective, that we have the two, where we come from our own points, reasons for being there, our purpose, maybe even how we view the other person's purpose, but we have the same objective and we can roughly triangulate around that. And one of the things I found talking with some people when it comes to law, taxation, emotional bulwarks is personal philosophy or the reference point. If they think life's a bitch and then you die, if they think America is the worst country in the world, to talk to them about the system and how the system works, they won't listen to it.
Right.
They because when the system is flawed, it's just, see, of course it's flawed because America's so bad. And where it works, it's, of course it works that way because that's how it's supposed to work.
Mm-hmm.
Or the flaw is actually how it's supposed to work, and when it works right, that's the exception,
Mm-hmm.
not the rule. Not having that frame of reference is destructive for any sort of dialogue. And I've had that before where, with a girlfriend, do you want me to help you find a solution, or do you just need me to listen to you?
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes if I'm unsure, I just have to ask that question.
All right.
And then once I know, I can do one or the other, and it's fine.
Right.
Finding that reference point with people when it comes to, especially comes to emotional topics, finding out what their reference point is, what it's
Mm-hmm.
framed around. Again, coming back to not being emotionally reactive, people who think it's all about them,
Mm-hmm.
people who claim to be empaths, be empathetic people, but instead they're so self-absorbed they just take everything personally.
All right.
And then entirely becomes about them. And that's one of the fascinating things that I had my attention drawn to, and I didn't even think about it until I'd heard it a few times, is one of the reasons why we men don't talk about our issues with women, like as a norm, even to our wives, is because the wife tends to take it personally, and then we have to then deal with our own emotional turmoil while comforting our wife because she's taking it
Right.
personally because she thinks our happiness is wrapped up in her and what she's doing, and that if she were the perfect wife, then we wouldn't be in any way dissatisfied or unhappy. And it's like, no, 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 my dog just died. This has nothing to do with you. You know,
Right.
no, no. And that's one thing I found why it's so important to have, for a man to have male friends, is because being able to process that out with a man is so important, rather than someone who cares so much about our personal well-being that they take it upon themselves for us to feel good.
Mm-hmm.
And not understanding that reference point leads to so much, just like what you brought back with your daughter, is, yeah, but can you walk across fire?
Mm-hmm.
Being able to bring back a frame of reference instead of just,
Right.
oh,
Yeah.
this is it, with no context,
Right.
no shared reference point for there to be a dialogue.
Right. Right. And the whole purpose is as incomprehensible as this seems, I've done other things that are really incomprehensible, and it works out whenever you take action. You know, whenever you have, of course, it's. I got to preface that it's whenever you have direction and then take action in the right direction, because there is such a thing as wrong action,
Right. It's
and
just,
any forced action is wrong action.
right.
If you have to force it, you're on the wrong trail.
Yeah, it's like that old joke. Love is like a fart. If you have to force it, it's probably.
Yeah.
You know, I'm not wrong. I may be wrong for saying it, but I'm not wrong.
Yeah, right. Right. Yeah, I was watching a YouTube presentation yesterday, and I don't know, it might have even been a short, but whatever. It was these people, and they were primarily, I'm going to say, between 20 and 30 or 35 years old, and were both male and female on there doing this, and it was four or five of them. And they said, I accept responsibility for the way black people were treated in slavery. What's that mean? You know, you're making $40,000 a year. There's 50 million black people. You're going to give each one of them 95 cents. That going to make it right? And there's some things that are wrong, and you know, that's one of them. Slavery is one of them. Um, and no amount of apologies after it happened are going to suffice for this, and no amount of reparation can even do it. The only thing you can do is stop it.
Right.
And of course, that's what the American North Republicans were doing in 1860, was stopping it.
Right. And there were for sure very practical reasons too that involved economics and markets and all of that stuff. But there was still the idea that under a constitutional republic that we've established, individual rights trump those of state rights.
Right.
And there were for sure other forces involved in the Civil War. It was not just everyone's pure intention of stopping chattel slavery, but that absolutely was the legal factor upon which it was based.
Yeah, one of the things that happened was the states the states were struggling financially because of all these market trends and that sort of stuff that were moving up and down. And the southern states, primarily income stream, was marketing tobacco and cotton to Europe and to the rest of the world. And that required a lot of labor, and slavery was the thing to do about it. I watched a thing yesterday where it was saying that the first slaveholder in the colonies was a black man, and he owned 5 slaves. 2 of them were his sons, and at the time, slavery was a temporary deal.
Mm.
And it had a certain amount of time to it. And if you put in the time working, then, the indenturement, and that's where they got the term indentured servitude. Indentured servitude seemed to be a thing out of Germany, and slavery seemed to be the same thing out of England. But it was slavery or indentured servitude. That now we can't force anybody into. Um, that this guy had not only bought other slaves, he bought their contracts. He was a slave himself. He was an indentured servant himself, and as soon as he got out of his indenturement, then he indentured 5 others. 2 of them were his sons, and the law of the state at that time was that if you have an indentured servant, you have a right to claim another 50 acres of land. So he claimed 250 acres of land plus 50 for him was
Oh.
was 300 acres of land because he had the servants to work the land.
And his sons maybe that was just a legal process.
Right, that was a legal process, and his oldest son ended up doing the same thing, and he not only enslaved one of his sons, he enslaved 3 or 4 other people. Some of them his dad knew, but it was all about commerce in that moment in time.
Right.
Was the products that they were selling was cotton and tobacco, and they had a very prosperous tobacco farm, and they were because of their prosperity, black people were allowed to vote in colonial uh, processes,
Because
and
they owned land.
right, because they were property owners.
Right. Well, that's one of the things is that there's so much that now may seem so odd to us that occurred in all these processes. Now, just because they make logical sense and they tracked logically with the law, it's not justification by our current social mores and moral standards. But being unable to grasp that different people, different times, that superficial sense of moral superiority that some people practice when it comes to stuff like that is exhausting at best, because you just can't talk to them about really anything. The thing is, though, what's interesting is that when it came to the people who bought up slaves that were rounded up by the other African tribes and then sold for watered down rum, people who were involved in a truly barbaric process, those people have in common with current postmodern thinkers, cultural Marxists, outright communists, is this idea that people are just bundles of cells.
Mm-hmm.
People don't have an inherent value.
Right.
People are what you make of them. They're just widgets that from birth you can tweak them, and that's with this all these people in psychology and sociology is where it's, oh, these people aren't people. We can make them what we want them to be if we just change their environment and brainwash them.
Yeah, you know why people adopt that attitude?
Why?
They don't have any value of themselves.
That's true. And plus, if they adopt the idea that we're all equal, then that means, in their minds, that means they're just the same as the bum on the street.
Right.
They cannot and will not accept the idea of a fellow human being being a fellow human being if they perceive that person to be
Right.
below them.
Right.
And that was one of the interesting things I've heard about, was where with these institutions, and the reference point is that, and I've seen it at church too, where the wealthiest people sit with the poorest people.
Mm-hmm.
They have this reference point, whereas now the institutions where all the rich hang out together are at rich people's parties.
Mm-hmm.
And if they go to a church, it's because it's the church there in Washington, D.C., downtown, or the cathedral, or the church in Beverly Hills, if they go to one at all. Then it's all just all the same people, and a lot of these people are sincerely surprised that other people don't think the way they do.
Mm-hmm.
They're absolutely surprised that what they think is not the norm.
Right.
And this idea that we all have an inherent value is a deeply religious declaration of faith, I think, based on, because if it's all just seen as Newtonian mechanics of clumps of cells, and people are not individuals, they are their group identity, then that's a that's a destruction of the concept of the individual, which makes it a lot easier to actually ignore, manipulate, control, or destroy individuals.
Mm-hmm.
Once that concept is changed of, this is not a person, this person is put in group.
Right.
This person is black, this person is a Jew, this person is white, this person is a Christian, this person is a Muslim. It's this person is a. It's not this person is.
Right.
And that getting broken down is the same exact. It comes from the same mentality of people who were involved in barbaric chattel slavery.
Mm-hmm.
Is where this person is not a person, and I am a person. This person is a slave.
Mm-hmm.
This person is an Irishman or a Slav or an African, and therefore this person is not a Christian, or this person is not a Jew, or this person is not a Muslim. And that's one of the things that just doesn't get talked about in this intersectional battle of wills, is there was just as many or more black African slaves that were shipped off to the Middle East. They just don't have all the black people we have because all the black males were castrated.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But but
Well,
they
and
don't catch flack for that.
yeah, whenever you take a look at the figures that everybody are throwing around today, there was 12, 13 million uh, black people imported to the Americas, exported to the Americas as slaves, but there was only 450,000 of them in the colonies. The
Right.
rest all went to, Central America and South America, um, under Spanish rule or Portuguese rule or whoever was in the part of the process. Um, and another thing that I think is really important to take into consideration here is that a couple hundred years ago, just getting enough food to survive was a real problem. If you didn't have land, that was the big draw for America, was all the free land. That if you were born and raised in England and you weren't of gentry or the controlling group there, you didn't own any land.
Which means you could not be self-sufficient.
Right, and there was no way to gain or get out of that process. You had to work, and of course, those who work uh, for dukes and earls that were economically smart people that were doing things for profit and that sort of stuff, they were so successful that you, as their servant, had food year round.
Right.
And you had food for every member of your family and everything like that. So compare that to somebody who's traveling from one country to another and has none of those things. They're facing starvation every day. And that's why indentured servitude became a real popular thing. At the time, there were guilds involved in all mechanical stuff from candle making to carpentry to uh, stonework, any of that kind of stuff. There was like a 7-year apprenticeship. Well, that's what the indentured servitudes were to farming.
Right.
If you didn't know anything about farming, you could sign a 7-year contract with a farmer, and you would learn how to farm. You would be giving your labor for that knowledge, and he would be giving you food for you and your family and a place to stay.
Right. It was a contract.
Right.
It was a legal
Right.
contract.
And it really was an equitable contract too.
Right.
You know, um, and it's what allows capitalism to be capitalism. The Supreme Court tells us that the most sacred capital that a man has is his labor. That's why it can't be taxed. It's capital.
Right.
It's not gain.
Right. And he has it inherently.
Right.
It's not something that was produced by an outside source.
Right, and certainly not by government.
Right. Right. Well, that's a really really great point you brought up about the land. Is America attracted all of the people who had any sort of gumption and who had a desire to be self-sufficient.
Right, and they had no readily obtainable way to attracting land in their home country.
Right. Right, because that was reserved for, to own land, you had to have
Right.
title.
So then the states, even as colonies, they needed people to come in to own land so that they could tax it.
Tax it.
Yeah, right.
That they could tax the production.
Right, they could tax the production on it. And that's really what land taxes were about, was production. It wasn't on the land itself.
Right, it was
Wasn't
on the production.
Yeah, it was on the amount of production that you produced.
Right, it's what came of that, and one of the reasons why the state had the right to tax what you produce is because the state was responsible for protecting the land.
Right. But where was it taxable? It wasn't taxable to the person that owned the land. It was taxable upon the people that bought the product that came
from
from
the
the
land.
land.
Right, and that was the source. The land was not the
Right,
source of tax.
was not the source.
It
It
was
was
at
the
the point of
production.
sale.
Yeah, the
Right.
production of the point of commercial sale.
And they had to do it at the point of commercial sale, not at point of harvest, because there's always some part of the harvest that wasn't sellable,
Right,
which means then comes back to you only get taxed for the profit,
right,
not for what you produce. You get taxed for your profit,
right,
which makes perfect sense.
right.
And
And it's the way it still is today. If you start with the Taxing Act, that act will name what part of the commercial process is the tax laid upon.
right, right.
So these are all very easily uh, supported, found out facts, um, because every taxing act of Congress, whenever the secretary promulgates it into law, it's put into the Federal Register. And it's given a Federal Register date and citation number and everything like that. So you can follow the process from beginning to end. That's the end of the process.
Right.
Is when it's done there. And there are only currently there are 169 different sources of income that the federal government taxes. And if you don't derive income from any of those sources, then you're not a taxpayer for that meaning of that term in that process. Now, all of these excise taxes, which the government, the federal government, we'll talk about here, produces, all comes down to us, the general public, because just like the federal government imposes an 18% excise tax on gasoline, they have a 35% excise tax on diesel. The person made liable to pay that tax is somebody at Exxon or Mobil or whoever at the cracking plant. That's where the tax is imposed, and that's who has to collect it. They are the taxpayer, but when we pull up to the pump, it's coming out of our pocket.
Right. So just because we fund the tax does not mean we're the one responsible for paying the
Right,
tax.
for collecting it and paying it over.
Right. Well, we're going to have to go into all of this. I think the next podcast with you, we'll do a deep dive on basically just the taxes, because this was kind of a broad overview, and I think it'd be good to
Right.
go into more of a deep dive.
Sure.
And it's just one of those things where words mean things. Words mean things when it comes to creating a dialogue between people and knowing what words to use and to not use. And terms mean thing in a very real and legal sense when
Right.
it comes to what is what, and knowing, again, we were populated by people who wanted to be self-sufficient, who were excited about the idea of being self-sufficient, and insisted on creating a government that not only recognized but protected their natural God-given rights.
Mm-hmm.
And
right, and those natural God-given rights are first and foremost. Everything else is subject to them.
Right, it is the highest and the lowest.
Right, right, and it needs to be processed that way. That's what I'm saying about, if you want to understand tax law, the first thing you have to understand is the system that it's based on. And it's based on first the act of Congress, then it's signed by the president, then it goes to the Secretary of the Treasury. She promulgates it into law by saying what particular sections of the United States Code is authorized for that. And then she publishes all of that in the Federal Register. So that's the first thing you need to do, is follow it the whole way through to the Federal Register site.
Right.
Now you have something that you can look at on paper and say, okay, does this apply to me? Does it not apply to me? Uh, and who is the person made liable?
Right.
And if you're obviously not in that position, I mean, if you're talking about who's made liable to collect the 18% firearms tax, you have to be somebody who's working for Remington or Winchester or somebody like that, that is a higher up in the company, probably a CFO, if not the CEO of the company, is the person made liable to collect that tax. You and I, when we go to the store and we buy ammunition or a gun, it's coming out of our pocket. That's
Right.
where that 18% is ultimately coming from.
But the onus is not on us to make sure we pay it.
Right.
Right. Right. Well, that's one of the things. We were populated by people who wanted to be self-sufficient, who knew their rights. And
Yeah,
if
and that's the big thing we need to get forward to, rather than back to, is understanding what our rights are and where they come from, and the difference between a right and a privilege.
right, right. And that's again, words mean things, and this is where people get confused. Where healthcare is a right. No, it's not.
Yeah.
That's a privilege.
Well, yeah, yeah. If you could
It
even if you could even call it that.
right. Well, it's just if it's something you get from someone else, it is a privilege. It's not a right.
Right.
The rights are inherent.
Yeah. Yeah. You have a right to be healthy, but that takes conscious effort.
Right. And you also have a right to self delete.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Not,
Yeah. Not according to the law, but you know,
well,
what
sometimes
are
they.
they going to do about it if you do?
Right. Right. Yeah. They'll just keep trying to tax you.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Cool. Well, thanks so much, Cliff. This was a fun conversation, and next time you and I will go on a deeper, detailed dive into the process of law and tax and
Right.
maybe some solutions and give people new ideas because that's where all the
Right.
power comes from
Yeah.
is
And
having the change of ideas.
once you realize, and it's taken me 35 years to realize what I realize now, uh, because fortunately or unfortunately, I don't have any legal training, schooling, or anything like that, which I now realize is what screws everything up. Is you're listening to a professor that doesn't know what he's talking about.
Right. That happens more often than I mean Hillary Clinton is now a professor of foreign affairs at Columbia.
Oh yeah,
Kept failing upwards.
yeah. Well, I wonder how many of her foreign affairs she talks about.
I don't even think she talks about her husband's domestic affairs.
Right.
So, all right, Cliff. Well, thanks so much, man, and look forward to seeing you next time.
Okay. Talk to you later.